things like even when you approach sponsors, look at any of the praise that you've received in feedback, and you can show that off to sponsors or potential partners to show, here's what my audience is saying. Here's the impact my podcast is making on my audience. Look at the change my audience is achieving through my podcast.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, podcaster, it's your host and coach, Adam A. Adams, and I'm with Daniel J. Lewis here in the house. And we're going to talk about how you can engage with your audience, how you can make that engagement grow your show, grow your stats, and some pitfalls that you might be falling into. And I think, Daniel, I feel like we've been friends, or we've been connected at least for about 4+ years, which is great. I love watching your content, and I like that you always speak from your heart. And talking about engagement and engaging with your audience today on this episode is going to be something that I know you're going to be able to speak well to. So I want to start by understanding. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, thinking that the listeners saying to themselves, okay, engagement, I heard it's important. How do I, get that first step there? What do you think?
Yeah, whether you are just starting out or you've been doing this for a while and you have yet to actually hear from your audience, so much depends on that first piece of engagement, because you can use that for other ways to get more engagement later. But how you get that first piece of engagement, what you really have to focus on first, and we're going to come back to this point probably multiple times in this discussion, is you have to make sure you are delivering good value first. Make sure you're delivering on whatever the promise is of your podcast, whatever it is that people are coming to your podcast for. Make sure you deliver that episode after episode and as early as possible in your episodes before you ask for anything in return. Now, the ask is where the engagement can start. Don't just ask questions like, what did you think of this episode? Because a common response people might have is, it was okay. Or, yeah, I liked it. That's not really engaging. You need to ask them a specific question that is also open enough that it inspires them to respond in some way. So some different examples could be like here with Grow Your Show. You're talking to podcasters, helping them grow their shows. One of the questions you can probably ask, and you probably have asked this, is what is one technique you have used that you've seen make the biggest result in the growth of your show? And if someone asked me that, I could give some crazy off-the-wall answer of something ridiculous that I did once that actually worked to literally overnight, septuple my audience downloads and subscriptions. We can talk about that separately, but that's the kind of thing you want to ask your audience for, something specific that they can give a response, an answer, a tip, some experience that they have. Focus on that and how it relates to your content, especially if you can use that for an upcoming episode. So you see other podcasters do this frequently where they might have a theme show or a question of the month or something like that, where they give themselves enough time in advance, especially if you have a small audience, you need more time to collect some feedback. But ask in advance, I'm doing an episode upcoming about this, and I would love to have your voice included or your perspective included. So please let me know. And then you ask the question, or you tell them what you want. Or maybe it is you're going to do an episode specifically to answer their question. So you ask them, what question would you like me to answer for you in an upcoming episode of my podcast? And you can be specific about that. You can say like, what question would you like me to answer about advertising on Facebook and Instagram? Or what question would you like me to answer about crazy noises you hear coming from your car, or anything like that? So you're giving them some ideas of where to start with that first question. And along with that, whatever method you use for collecting feedback, I have a tool that I've created that does that. There are plenty of tools out there that help you collect the feedback. Whatever it is that you're using, make it as dead simple as possible for your audience. don't make it complicated. Make it memorable, make it simple, make it branded to your podcast, not to some other service out there.
Yeah. Love it. And by the way, to the listener, Daniel J. Lewis is the host of a very popular podcast within the podcasting space. He helps people like you and me. It's called the Audacity to Podcast show. So anyway, Daniel, I got an incredible amount of notes on this. I'm going to throw it back at the listener to make sure that they got enough to write notes on. So Daniel's talking about how you can get your first engagement on your podcast. And there are many, many ways to get engagement on a show. But I heard him say some things that are incredibly valuable and different from what you may have thought before. One of those things is, first and foremost, make sure that you are delivering actual value. And he said it in these words, delivering on your promise on your show. So whatever value you say you're giving to your listener, make sure you're doing that before you ever ask for anything. And now he gives some tips. And he says, for example, you could ask, hey, what is one technique that you have used to fill in the blank? Fill in the blank. What is one technique that you've used to do this? Whatever your podcast is about. Ask your audience a tip. And I'm thinking through this in the psychology of asking your audience for a tip or a suggestion. And ding, 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 what's really cool is human psychology makes it very challenging for us not to offer feedback. So if you're asked by me or by Daniel, or if you ask your audience, your listener, hey, can you give me a tip? What's a cool thing you've done within my genre? They're more likely to give you that tip versus some of the other examples that Daniel gave that people are less likely. He also mentioned having a theme show or a question of the month. And he worded it this way: I would love to have your voice or your insight included in the show. All right, Daniel, I want to also talk about how to get more engagement. So we figure out how to get that very first step, and the listener just took that step and they're about to say, hey, I want to ramp this up. What do they do to get it a little bit larger?
Once you have some engagement, use that as leverage. Use it in your podcast. Give a shout out to people. Do things when your podcast is small. Do things that may not scale, and that can involve giving those shout outs, including links in your podcast notes, praising the people who send you feedback or for their accomplishments or whatever it is that they share with you. Because here's the thing, you want them to become a celebrity to your audience. You want them to be part of your show. This does two things for you on two different sides. First of all, for that person who sent the feedback to you and you used their feedback somehow in your show, that's going to help turn them into a super fan, because suddenly they're like, I heard my name on the show. This celebrity that I listened to, because you're probably a celebrity in their minds to some degree, but they're thinking they used my feedback. They answered my question. They mentioned me on their show. They gave me a shout out. They linked to my whatever it is. That turns them into a super fan that then they'll be more eager to tell other people, hey, you got to listen to this podcast because they talked to me. They answered my question. They hear my shout out, hear my story read in this podcast, anything like that. So that helps grow your show in that aspect, where you've turned that casual listener into a super fan by getting them engaged. And also, since they've been engaged in some degree, they're more likely to engage more later, as well as more likely to stick around because they have engaged. They've started building that relationship with you. So that's the person who sent you that engagement. For everyone else, when they hear you mention someone else's name on your show, or read someone else's feedback or rating or review or anything like that, many other people will start to think, hey, that's really cool. They included his or her feedback. I'd like my feedback included too. I want my thing shouted out. I want my funny joke told. I want my story shared. I want my question answered too. I want my voice in the podcast too. How can I get a piece of this as well? So they start to feed into that too. And you start to build this relationship with a broader audience, and it becomes almost viral, but in a good way, where they are encouraged because they want to be part of what they see other people joining.
Yeah. That's brilliant. I love it. And yeah, use that engagement that you're already getting and leverage the shout outs. And, as you said, you want them or your audience to become a celebrity to your audience. You want them to be able to feel like, hey, I'm famous. He shouted me out. And, once they use your name, it feels really good. And it does also do, like you said, the social proofing, which is to get others who didn't yet give any engagement to say, ooh, I should do that too. And I'm curious, Daniel, and I think our listener is as well, how does this really benefit the growth of our podcast? How do we use this engagement to essentially get more listeners? Is that possible?
Absolutely. Because it starts with that person you're engaging with. They want to tell other people. And that is your most powerful evangelist for your podcast is your listener, the person already consuming your podcast, already engaged. They are the greatest force for helping to grow your podcast because they can use their own opinions and enthusiasm for your show to get other people listening to your show as well. Also, when you start using this feedback, your podcast can eventually become known as a podcast that engages with its audience and that answers the audience's needs or whatever type of thing your podcast does. For example, give a shout out here to another podcast. That Story Show is a podcast that shares funny life stories. It's a family-friendly, clean comedy podcast. And they have become known as the family-friendly funny story show where they share funny life stories. And so lots of people like to send in their funny life stories to that show, That Story Show. It's a great name for that show. And that helps grow their audience because they are known for that. They provide great value. And the people who then send those stories in and have their stories shared in the podcast, they want to tell everyone else because it's funny. They like sharing their own funny stories. Hey, hear my funny story in this podcast. When you also look at your engagement as what you can do, what you as the podcaster can do with that engagement outside of the podcast as well. Like you can look for places where people have asked similar questions as your audience has asked for your podcast and answered. Like take Reddit or Facebook groups. Now, anytime you look into an online community, make sure you're following the rules. Some groups are very strict about what they call self-promotion. But in general, if you're providing value first, they're often more forgiving of letting you promote something that builds on top of the value you're already giving. So let's say one of your audience members asks you the question, how do I fix this problem on my car? And you have a car podcast. So you answer that question, how to fix that problem on their car. Then you get into social networks and you see other people ask that same question. So you can go comment on that, give the brief answer, give value first, and then you can say, by the way, one of my listeners from my podcast asked this question too, and you can hear me talk about it in this episode of my podcast. So now you've got very targeted, specific promotional opportunities around the content that you created that was inspired by the feedback that you gained from your audience. And there's something extra special about it. Instead of just saying, I created this episode that addresses this, to I created this episode that someone else was asking this same question. It feels validating, I think, for someone to see, oh, yeah, other people have the same question I do, and you answered it for her. That might be a good answer for me too. I'm more interested in it. So it makes you more relatable and helps give you those opportunities. You can also look at things like even when you approach sponsors, look at any of the praise that you've received in feedback, and you can show that off to sponsors or potential partners to show, here's what my audience is saying. Here's the impact my podcast is making on my audience. Look at the change my audience is achieving through my podcast. Look at whatever that thing is that your audience, the value they are getting from your podcast. When you can demonstrate that to a partner, a promotional opportunity, a sponsor, things like that, that can be more compelling than merely numbers, because then they see, wow, you have a good connection with your audience and you are impacting your audience. You're not just someone that people listen to and forget about, but you're changing the lives of your audience members. We want to be part of this in some way, or we want to help you grow too, or we want to sponsor, we want to include you in our event. All of those opportunities and things start to compound like that as you really diversify how you are growing your show.
Yeah. Hey, how is it scalable, or can it be more scalable? Because earlier you said, I'm definitely putting some words in your mouth, so feel free to correct me. You said something to the effect of, when you're smaller, this is easy. You'll get a little bit of feedback here and there, and you use that to the advantage of growing the show, the audience, the reputation. And what I'm wondering, and I think maybe a listener might be wondering as well, is like, how do we continue to grow this as our podcast gets larger?
It's a great problem to have when you have too much feedback that you can handle in your podcast. And what I love about that is, well, it tells that you're doing something really good and your audience is really engaging. You can start to become a little bit more picky about what feedback that you use. Like, I did a podcast. It was the #1 fan podcast for the TV show Once Upon a Time. And we got so much feedback from that show because it was by some of the same people who made the show Lost. And so there was a lot to theorize about, a lot of Easter eggs and hidden things and clues, stuff we were trying to figure out. So we got so much feedback from our audience that they had their own theories, their own observations. And let's just be honest, some of it wasn't good. Some of the theories were bad theories, or just weren't thought out very well, weren't communicated very well. So we couldn't use all of it, but we had more than we could use. So a couple ways that we were still able to scale that. Within the podcast, it was very easy to still give recognition to people who sent feedback simply with a mention. Like, if we got an idea from something that they brought up, maybe they didn't communicate it very well, but we got the general gist of their idea and it inspires a conversation, we could say, yeah, Jim and Sally and Sue also suggested something similar to this. So we're still giving them a shout out. We're still letting them know we saw your feedback or heard your feedback, and we use that in some way. Sometimes you can use the feedback directly and be picky then about the quality of it, making sure that you get quality questions, the truly funny stories, that whatever it is. And by the way, when it comes to like humor, even sometimes the humor in a story can be in how you respond to their story, not just only in how they tell it. So think through that as well. The same thing, like any questions or feedback that you receive, there might be more value that you pull from the feedback, not simply dumping the feedback into your episode, but you're working with it. You're molding it into something for your podcast, whether that is just you taking the concept of what they share or you're taking verbatim what they share. Then the second thing is when you're just getting so much feedback that you can't even handle all of this, or there's just so much stuff that you feel like this is all so fantastic, but there's no way I can even read all of this to even digest what's good or bad. You could look for volunteers with your audience to help with that. But what's really exciting that you can do when you get to this point is start your own community. And there are many different technologies for this: Slack, Discord, Facebook groups, subreddits, your own forums, anything like that. Some place where your audience can go and start their own conversations and respond directly to each other. So you are no longer the sole controller of the conversation. Some people get scared by that, but it's okay. That's a good thing when your audience can talk with each other. But you're creating a community where you become the leader of that community. They can then post their own ideas, their own feedback. Others can comment on it. You can get tagged in things or discover what is rising to the top as a lot of people are commenting on this and agreeing with this, or a lot of other people have the same question. So then it's not completely a one-to-one with you and your listener, but it can be one-to-many, while still you're finding those opportunities that here's a question, a lot of people asked this last month. Here's something that a lot of people really liked this idea. They upvoted this, or whatever your metric is that you use. And when your community then starts to build relationships among each other, that also turns into a more loyal base. And there can even come a point where your community might attract people more than your podcast does. So there might actually come a point where while you start out, the podcast promotes the community, later in the future, the community might promote the podcast because the community has grown bigger than your podcast has. I had that with my own TV show fan podcast. We had one of the biggest communities online. I made sure that every question that someone posted in the forums, we had our own forums back then. We didn't use Facebook groups. So our search ranking for many of these things was fantastic because people would post on our forums. I made sure that the SEO was there so that it would get indexed by Google and all of this. So as people would search for questions about the show, they would often find our forum, come join our forum, communicate with other listeners of the show and viewers of the TV show. And then they discover, oh, there's a podcast that goes along with this and they're discussing some of our feedback and incorporating some of our ideas. I want in on that.
Yeah. I was going to say that I've seen that happen with multiple people where, for even me, I started a podcast about a certain genre, and then I started hosting conferences with hundreds of people about that same genre. And it was sad and cool and happy and weird all at the same time when I would find out that, only 20% of the audience listened to my podcast. I'm like, well, then how did you find me? How did you ever know about the event? And they found out about the event because a friend told them about a different event, or because a friend was going to the event and said, hey, you should come here too, and other things. But that also helped to grow the podcast again, because we were on stage in front of a lot of people and we mentioned, hey, is anybody worried about this problem in genre? And everybody raises their hand because you created it ahead of time. And you can then say, on episode, let's just say 500, we talk all about the 5 ways that you can solve this problem within genre. And then you get 600 people that are in front of you, or 6,000 people that are in front of you, to be like, yeah, no, that sounds like a valuable episode. I need that. And so you can gain a little bit of listeners after. The same thing happened when I went to someone else's conference, and they were like, oh, he's got a podcast. And I'm thinking to myself, you seriously didn't know? He has one of the most popular podcasts in genre of anyone, and you didn't know he even had one? I mean, I get it if you're not listening to it, but you didn't even know he had one. So love that piece that you said, where it's like, you start the community in Slack or Facebook or whatever, but also the interesting piece to your community could probably become larger than the podcast. You also mentioned a couple other cool things about this scaling. First one that I heard was that it's a good problem to have. So that's good. Second one is you talked a little bit about when there's feedback that you don't know if you can really, really use, how you can name drop a couple of people. I think you said Jam, Sally, and another person said something similar to this, and then you share your idea. And then they're like, yeah, I was on the right track. And he mentioned me. And also you mentioned finding the humor, even if that humor is within your own response to that person's feedback, which I thought was really, really good. And then, starting your own community. So you had a community, and this was before there was Facebook groups.
Facebook groups existed. The thing about Facebook groups is you're competing with so much on Facebook when you have a group, and Facebook is constantly changing things. They're changing the algorithms, and it's gotten to the point that I don't even look at my main Facebook feed. I actually have an extension that just blocks that so it doesn't distract me. But I love participating in groups. So I would go to the groups feed, which is easier to get to on a computer because you can go to, I think it's just facebook.com/groups/feed. But they recently broke that. So I'm not seeing all of my groups anymore. And you're at the mercy of a platform like that. They might break something, that might change their minds. They might cancel you for whatever reason. There can be all kinds of reasons like that you might not want to build your whole empire on someone else's platform. So as much as you can, I suggest trying to own it. At the same time, you also do have to think about what is easiest for your audience. Back when I had that community for my show, although Facebook was popular, forums were still popular enough that people were familiar with signing up for a forum on a website. That's not so popular anymore, but things like Discord groups and Facebook and subreddit and things like that are popular. You just have to think about what is the potential risk of these things. But the most important thing is that it be easy for your audience to participate and easy for you to follow along to see what your community is saying.
Yeah. Well, I want to go in and I want you to share a little bit about the pitfalls that you're seeing with new podcasters, things that they're doing wrong. Let's take a super quick break. And when we get back, let's talk about those pitfalls. We'll be right back.
Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, growyourshow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show.
We're back with Daniel J. Lewis, multiple podcaster. He does podcast with a friend of mine, Dave Jackson, which is talking all about the future of podcasting. So you might want to find that. I'm going to make sure that our editor has the link to that, as well as the Audacity to podcast. Those two links will be in the show, so you can find more about Daniel. Before the break, we talked about some pitfalls that you might be going through. You might approach soon. You might have already made and you don't want to anymore. Daniel, I'm going to turn it over to you. Will you share some pitfalls that podcasters make?
I think it comes down to this one thing that, just to be blunt, it's selfishness. Starting a podcast and expecting only things for you, expecting value only for you, wanting everything to be about you and only what you want to get from your podcast. I teach a principle that I call the podcast profit paradigm, PROFIT. That stands for popularity, relationships, opportunities, fun, income, and tangibles. These are one or multiple things that you might get from your podcast and why you might be running your podcast. Maybe you want to make money. That's the income. Maybe you just want to have fun. Well, that's part of profiting from your podcast too. But what you need to focus on is, what does your listener get from your podcast? How do they profit from your podcast? How are you helping them with their popularity, relationships, opportunities, fun, income, and tangibles in their own lives, professional or personal lives? So when we're starting out, we can often think too much about ourselves, thinking, hey, leave a rating and review, subscribe to the podcast, support me on Patreon, buy my products, do all of this stuff. And we often make the mistake of asking for all of this stuff for ourselves up front and first. And that's a big no-no. Do not ask for things for yourself first. Give first. Give through the value of your podcast, through whatever that profit is that your audience should be getting from your podcast. Give that first, or at least give some of it first before you ask for anything in return. Apply that both on the micro level of your individual episodes and the macro level of your whole podcast. Like, if you want to have supporters through ongoing subscriptions or value for value payments or anything like that, it's okay to ask in your first episode, but you could also think about maybe you wait a few episodes before you ask. Or the same thing like with an email newsletter. Or I like the way that Gary Vaynerchuk puts this, is jab, jab, right hook, where you're doing these other things first before you come in with the value you're asking back from your audience. So deliver that value first in your episode. Make the first minute of your episode, the first seconds, if possible, jump quickly into that value you want to deliver. Don't ask for subscriptions or ratings or reviews or donations or anything like that up front. Ask for that later. Or maybe you could put that in the middle of your episode or intersperse some of those calls to action throughout your episode. That's more impactful as well. I think about this often. You see this so much at conferences. And I get a little bit annoyed almost every time I see it, is a conference speaker will start off with, let me tell you a little bit about myself. No, to be honest, I don't care yet. And that's the key, is I don't quite care yet about your background and history or anything like that, unless that background is part of your content. Like you're telling the story of how you survived some miraculous thing and then some lessons that you learned from that. Then yes, you tell that story first because that is the content that people are coming for. But if it's all of this, I grew up in such and such place and I have this background and I run these companies and such. Okay, now let's get into the content. That whole kind of thing, that can be cut out at the beginning. Same thing in your podcast. You don't have to tell all about yourself up front. You don't have to give all your calls to action up front. Give the value first. And always focus on that value that you give so that it becomes a sense of growing a sense of reciprocity in your audience where they feel like she has given me so much value through her podcast. Yes, I absolutely want to give a 5-star review, or yes, I absolutely want to give some money back or buy this product or visit her sponsor or anything like that because I am so grateful for the value that she's given me. I want to give a little bit of value back to her. That's this concept that we have in podcasting called value for value, where you should be giving value in your podcast and your audience can figure out what that is worth to them and then consider giving some value back in the form of many different things like time, talent, or treasure, like money. That's building that sense of reciprocity among your audience to give back to you. And yes, it's okay if you are podcasting for profit in some way, and profit, not just money. It's okay if you're doing that. Don't forget your audience. Make sure they are profiting too.
Yeah. Lots of really insightful things, honestly. It's like I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, man, I wish more people out there would take this approach. And for us, we will help. So I've got a company that just supports podcasters. We will help people, for example, to rebrand their show or grow their show, or we'll just do the editing, for example. But when I listen to some of these shows, and you said it so well, the first minute, the beginning of the podcast, or even as you stated, really, you need to get this in the first few seconds. Like you really need to start with the jab, jab, right hook, the value right in the beginning. I see so many people that, for example, they have ads. You've got like 4 or 5 ads in the beginning. They're 20 seconds, they're 30 seconds, they're 45 seconds or a minute long, sometimes longer. Hopefully not. Listener, hopefully not longer than a minute. But what they all do is they'll put it right in the very beginning. And as you said, Daniel, this is like prime real estate, the beginning of your podcast. This is where you want the value. You want to lead with value. You want to give first. You want to be able to serve the listener, get them excited, get them attached to this episode, what they can get out of this episode, and other things like self-promotion, asking for things. I would say even having advertisements right in the beginning of the podcast before your listener ever feels value is the wrong way to do it. I love how you stated that, the first few seconds are super important. You mentioned, for example, you said, some of us, we might ask, how do I profit from my podcast? And Daniel, what he's saying instead is, you might be thinking, try to think first, like, how does my listener profit? How do I get my listener to make money in genre? How do I help them to be able to get to their next level? If you thought of that first, you would probably attract more people, grow your podcast as a whole, your listeners, your downloads, we talked a lot about on this episode, engagement. Probably get a lot more engagement if they could tell that you were doing how Daniel is talking, where he comes first with the value that he wants you to get. And I have to chuckle, I have to laugh, because something else that Daniel mentioned is how speakers get up and they just tell their whole bio. I hate that so much. They'll talk about, I have this many wives, I have this many dogs, I have this many marriages, I have this whatever. Like I have this many degrees from this many colleges, universities, 5-star this, what? It's like, dude or dudette, just get into the stuff, because I don't even know if I want to know this about you right now. And you mentioned how you could kind of cut that in the beginning of a podcast. And I do it, like, for example, even on this episode with you, Daniel, I didn't read a bio. I asked you to give me a bio, and it's currently in the show notes so the listener can get it any time. But I didn't spend any time saying all of the details about you. We jump right into something, and I hope we did a good job of, like, hey, here's some value for the listener. This is what the listener can get out of this, versus here's how many kids and wives and dogs Daniel has, how many podcasts he has, how many episodes he had, whatever. Some of that stuff is kind of secondary, and we should only share it, as Daniel mentioned, we should share that if it's part of the content, if it's valuable to what you're sharing today. We don't need to know that you have a doctorate degree unless that doctorate degree is what we're talking about today. We don't need to know all of just your whole history. So I'm loving that. And Daniel, you mentioned this word like 3+ times, reciprocity. Why don't you talk about the law of reciprocity for a second with the listener and talk about how that works in podcasting?
Yeah, when you are giving value to someone else over and over and over, there is a point where people will kind of just take that for granted and forget. But if you can point out that, and even ask them to think about, hey, has this been valuable to you? Have you enjoyed this? What would this be worth to you? I've heard some podcasters will even ask questions like, hey, this was a 1-hour podcast, and how much would it cost you to go watch a movie for an hour and a half, or whatever the length of a movie is? What's the cost of that? The cost of the gas, the cost of the movie ticket, maybe you get popcorn and drink. And these days you're looking at $50 or so to just see a movie in the theater. And did our podcast episode give you that kind of value, or that value in the month for all of the episodes we've released? What is that value that we've given to you? Would you consider giving some of that back? And that starts putting it in the audience's mind of realizing, oh yeah, I do really value this podcast, or I'd really hate it if this podcast wasn't producing episodes anymore. And as people recognize that, and they've built some level of a relationship and trust with you, then they start to think about, what are some ways that I can give back? And it's not always financial. Some people obviously cannot give money back to the podcast, but they might think, I love the podcast so much. I enjoy it so much. I get so much value from it. Is there anything else I could do to help give some of that value back, even though I don't have the money to give right now? And that's where you can tell your audience some of the other things they could do. Is like, the best thing your audience can do for you is get someone else listening to the podcast. And I like to say it that way, by the way, is not just say, share the show with others, but I like to say, get someone else listening, because that implies more action, not just telling someone, hey, you should listen to this podcast, but hey, I want to help you listen to this podcast, or let's listen to this podcast together. I think you'll really like it. Or, hey, did you listen to that podcast that I gave you? Equip them to give back in some way, in whatever way that they're able to. There might also be ways that they could use their talents to give back. And you could mention certain things like that in your podcast. You could say, if you have the talent to make artwork and you're inspired by our show, maybe there would be an opportunity for you to make artwork for every episode, and we can show that off and give a link to you in the notes. I know the No Agenda podcast does that, where while they are live streaming, and their show is long, it's about 3 hours twice a week, and they live stream it while they're recording. And while they are live streaming it, people are listening, and some people are making artwork based on what they hear talked about in the show. Different little stories that come out or things that are talked about. And some people use AI, some people draw it, some people use Photoshop, whatever they're doing. They're putting these things together. They submit them through a website. And then at the end of that live stream, the two podcast hosts look through all of the artwork that came in during the episode. And then they pick one to be the artwork for that episode. And then in the next episode, they give a shout out to that person whose artwork was chosen. And they give some comments on it, maybe a link back to that person. So there is that value exchange still, because the audience feels like this podcast is so much fun. It's so informative. It's so entertaining. It's changed my life in so many ways. Absolutely. Yes, I want to give back to it. The thing is, many people don't even think about that though, until you actually say something and ask. And you don't have to be begging with it, but you could just bring it up so that it starts in their mind thinking, how much do I value this podcast? And is there any way that I could give back?
Yeah. I used a technique similar to what you shared about the movies and popcorn and gas, the fuel that gets there, to get a first sponsor for me. And I shared this with a couple of clients, and they were able to get their first sponsor. And it was interesting because I felt like podcasts are kind of intangible. They're kind of challenging to understand sometimes. And so I used pretty much what you just said. I went and said, hey, if you were can I ask you a question? If you were to sponsor a conference, or I think I actually started at a different place. Do you sponsor podcasts, or do you sponsor conferences? They'll say, of course, that's how we get our name out. And then the question is, how much does it usually cost you to get in front of, let's just say, 300 people at a conference? And they'll say, oh, it's a $6,000 booth. And then we do a giveaway, and that's about $15,000. Or, 6,000 people. So it's this higher amount. Okay, great. Good to know. And is it just you who goes to the conference, or do you bring your team? And they're like, oh yeah, we always bring our team because we need Judy and we need, Emily or whatever to be there. And then I might say, so do you guys get hotels, all that on the company? They go, yes, it is. And then I'll ask, what about flights? Do you guys pay for Jody's flight, Emily's flight? And I'll just kind of ask these questions to that person to get an idea. And then I'll say, out of the 300 people that are at the conference, how many do you end up talking to? And they go, oh, maybe around like 30. Okay. So then I say, so it costs you $27,500 and 3 days of your life to get in front of 30 people. Why don't I have you be our top sponsor of the podcast? We have 300 people listening to every episode, and I can show you that we have at least 300 listening to every single episode. That way you're getting in front of the entire conference of people multiple times a week or multiple times a month. And we could do this for 6 months, and it's only going to cost you $21,000 instead of $27,000. And everybody's going to hear your message over and over for 6 months straight. Because it adds, I think, value or tangibility to something. And you did the exact same thing with just understanding for not sponsors specifically, but for your listener to, I guess, what are those called when the listener kind of gives you a little bit of money here and there? What are some ideas for our listener?
I like the term give back.
Okay.
You can say give back or gift back, because that implies some reciprocity in that very term, to give back, because they realize, well, to give back means you're giving to me in the first place. So yeah, I'm giving back some form of value.
I think sometimes I forget who said this, and that's okay. You'll probably know, Daniel. Somebody basically said you make about as much money as the value that you give. So if you can create more value to more people, then you're automatically going to make more money. You know, I think that's super valuable. And what you're sharing with us on this episode today, you're talking a lot about us, you know, giving value, starting with value, leading with value, not wasting too much of any listener time, especially in the beginning of the episode, not putting ads right there, not giving our whole background for no reason, but to really give them content. And that one question that you had earlier, which is basically, hey, how do I make money versus how does my listener make money from this show? I think that it's an impactful message for somebody who's, you know, newer in podcasting and growing. And I really appreciate your thoughts, your insights. I'm going to share, like you already know, your podcast episodes are in the show notes. So the listener can just click. Any social media that you wanted the listener to have is already down there. Your website is already down there. So really, really, really appreciate you for coming. That law of reciprocity is so powerful. I did a free group for a long time. And one day I just offered to do a mastermind. Hey, I want a few select people. And the amount of money that came in immediately was mind-boggling. It was more than I thought of, more than I was expecting. And I think it just comes down to, I led with value for a long time. And then the first time I asked people like, yes, finally I can give back to this guy. And that's a message for the listener who's a podcaster, has a business. Lead with value. Daniel J. Lewis, I appreciate your time. By the way, the next episode is going to be a good episode as well. If you have time, just stay right here. I'll see you there.
If you're glad that you checked out the podcast today, if you got some value out of this episode, some actionable takeaways, I invite you to do one of three things. A, you could do a written review on Apple. Let us know what you think. Just an honest written review. B, you could share the podcast with a friend of yours who needs it. Or C, at the very least, implement what you've learned to take your business and your podcast to the next level. And I'll see you on the next episode.